Kathy Bergen-Smith. She's going to be doing a presentation on the wreck of the 11J Marvel. What's the name of the book? Deadly Gamble. So thank you guys for coming in and for this presentation. Sandra Martin. She's actually the founder of New Bay Books, and I'll introduce her. Come on up, Sandra. She's going to introduce Kathy and talk about New Bay Books for just a minute. And just thank you guys for coming. Hopefully you guys got coffee and donuts and everything. We have a second presentation after she's finished. It's going to be on Waterman's Widow, and then at 1 o'clock we have Dennis Doyle with the 52 lessons learned from 50 years fishing on Bay.
I didn't hear the last one you said.
Oh, I was just talking about Dennis.
Oh,
Anyway,
yeah.
this is Sandra Martin. She's the publisher for New Bay Books, so I'll let her take over.
I wanted to say hello as well. I'm also a sadly ex-Herrington Harbor member since we sold ours up several years ago. And it's good to see all of you who didn't make that mistake. I was the publisher of a Bay Weekly newspaper, and when we sold that in 2020, I went into book publishing. And I've had the good fortune of publishing some of the finest tales I've ever read. They're all stories about the Chesapeake in one way or another. And leading off today will be Kathy Bergen-Smith, who reconstructed the whole story of the deadliest shipwreck in Chesapeake Bay and tells it wonderfully. So, go to it.
Thank you, Sandra. Sandra is also the best editor beyond the Chesapeake Bay, believe me. And thank you very much to Brad, who not only has all sorts of maritime skills, I'm sure, he's also an on-the-fly IT specialist. Believe me, that was a little bit of a challenge for me to start. But I'm here to talk today about a shipwreck, which it really couldn't be a better way to talk about. And so on the Chesapeake, all things bad weather and making bad decisions. And so hopefully you guys, if you know the story already, you may learn something new. If you don't, pay attention, because this occurred very close to here, literally in our backyard. So first off, let me tell you a little bit about the photography you'll see in this show. There was a very famous Baltimore photographer called Alwyn Bowden who worked for the Baltimore Sun for about 45 years, and he sailed on this ship, the 11 Marvel, that we're going to talk about today, both when it was a working schooner and when it was a passenger steamer. So his estate very generously opened up the doors to all of his photos, and you'll see some really great shots of the schooner and people working on it and playing on it. So the story of the 11J Marvel came to me in a kind of roundabout way. I was a photojournalist. I was working covering maritime issues, and I was sent to Norfolk to cover a hearing by the Coast Guard and jointly with the NTSB on the sinking of the tall ship Bounty back in Superstorm Sandy. You may remember that. Nobody was out in the ocean except the 40-year-old replica that Marlon Brando had pretend sailed on for the movie Beyond the Bounty, and it was moving to its winter berth and broke up, and the captain and a crew member were lost off of Cape Hatteras. And during that, the references kept being made to the 11J Marvel, and I noted it in my notes and kind of put it aside. That was 2012. And then much later, like right around COVID, I started wondering, what was this 11J Marvel thing? And I looked it up, and I found out that indeed, the 11J Marvel is the deadliest shipwreck on Chesapeake Bay to date. 14 people lost their lives in 1955. It was August 12th. Hurricane Connie was coming up the Chesapeake, and this 1800s schooner right down the road here, just in the mouth of Rockville Creek, about a mile offshore, and broke up in the storm, and everybody was thrown in. And of the 27 on board, 14 perished. So it was an amazing story, and not so well known, and I started researching it, and I highly encourage people that live in this area to go to the Bayside History Museum, not so much to look at this information, but to just generally get a feel for the area, and that is in North Beach. And so the North Beach Bayside History Museum, Grace Mary Kelly opened up her archive on this, and with the tracking down of some of the survivors, I was able to reconstruct the story. So first, let's talk a little bit about the 11J Marvel itself. It was built in 1898 in Bethel, Delaware. It was a working schooner, 3-master, 128 feet long. It had no engine. It was purpose-built to carry timber from the Tidewater region of Virginia and North Carolina north to Baltimore, Philadelphia, and New York, and backhaul fertilizer to those guys down in the south. It had this big empty hold, carried lots of lumber. It had a little 2-horsepower donkey motor on deck to help raise these giant gaff rig sails. Those are 90-foot masts. And it was built very narrow of beam. You can see it also had a centerboard because it had to get up into those narrow places. But it was very narrow because it was very competitive and it could get through the locks of the C&D Canal. Many of you may not know that there were locks in the original C&D Canal, and they were replaced in the 1920s. But during that period, if you were sailing these great cargo ships, you were going all the way around unless you could make it through that 26-foot opening. These guys could. So they were a very successful class of schooner called the Ram schooner. Here you have the beautiful Jenny B. Bell, and here's the trouble with schooner travel. They invented trucks, and the road network completely overtook our coastwise trade in schooners, and the age of sail really started to fade away by really about World War II. And just after World War II, a lot of these old schooners were cut down, and they were they put diesel engines in them. So, am I causing feedback? Is everything okay?
No, everything's fine.
Okay.
Will you walk over this way just a little bit?
Yes, sure.
Watch
So
your butt. Thank you.
This is the Jenny B. Bell. This is the last working ship in the U.S. Merchant Marine Registry. It was one of the Chesapeake Grand schooners, and it was berthed down in Salisbury, and it was run by a couple of 80-year-olds until it was a very bad season in 1970, I think, and his kids actually said, "You guys have got to move ashore." They lived on the boat with their 7 dogs. This is completely off subject. But it's the Jenny B. Bell, great story. But so most of these ships just mouldered like up in the weeds, but not the 11J Marvel. In 1946, there was a guy named Herman Nuss who worked for the B&O Railroad, and he was a real genius mechanic. And he was running their Mount Clair repair yard, which is just outside of Baltimore. He was a Maryland guy, and he got promoted to being in charge of their Elizabeth, New Jersey operation. And he did not see moving to Elizabeth, New Jersey as such a promotion for this Maryland farm boy. So he took a year off and he traveled and he went north and he rode a windjammer up in Maine. And he came back and he said, you know, this is a business model that would work in Maryland because we have a very forgiving shoreline and these big ships and schooners were all for sale for a song if they weren't abandoned. So he got the 11J Marvel and took that great cargo hold and built cabins in it. And then he took the bow and he made a nice big dining saloon for everybody to hang out, and then he built a deck house up in the stern. Again, so people could be on there, and then it had these big empty decks, and the booths for the gaff were way up here, so you had all sorts of room to run around and play on deck. Very successful business. People loved it. This is just after World War II, so people had some money in their pocket, and there were very few vacation opportunities. Chesapeake Bay Bridge had not been built, so people could come down and spend a week on the bay. He would take you to places like St. Michael's and Oxford, places that were legit fishing villages back then. And he also did the great thing of hiring a very good advertising guy from Annapolis, who created a suite of ads and ran them in the New York Times, the New York Magazine, Philadelphia papers, and Washington papers. So he attracted a clientele of rather well-heeled metropolitan people who felt like they needed to slow down, unplug for a week, and get on the bay. So it was also a romantic thing, you were going on sort of a dude cruise, like the dude ranch out west. You were invited to try to help to raise the salespeople or steer the ship. It was lots of fun, and it was super successful. And he ran that until 1952, and even added a second ship to the mix. And that ship was the Edwin and Maud, and they went further. They went on 1-week trips from downtown Annapolis on the Levin Marvel, and 2-week trips on the Edwin and Maud. In 52, Nuss decided to retire, and he sold the Edwin and Maud immediately to Windjammer Fleet up in Maine, and that actually went all summer, this summer. That well over 100-year-old ship was sailing last summer up in Maine. Not so the Levin Marvel. He couldn't find a buyer for the Marvel, so he kind of shoved it up in the weeds. And this guy came along, John Meckling, in 1953, and he said, "Man, if anybody could resurrect this business, it's me." He had no money. He was a big dreamer, big do-it-yourselfer, very good at fixing stuff, had kind of bounced around, had been in the Coast Guard during the war, bounced around, and owned a skipjack and sailed all around Chesapeake on the skipjack, and was a real raconteur. They say he looked a bit like a young Ronald Reagan, you might see that there. A very friendly face, happy guy, and he thought, I could do this. So he borrowed money from his cousin, and he bought the ship on a shoestring. Immediately, he sends out all of the advertising materials that had been from 1948. This is now the season of 1954. So the ship has been worn and also bears very little resemblance to what that ship looks like. But he buys it and takes a whole bunch of reservations for the 1954 season, and says, all right, it's in Salisbury, I'll hire one of the old captains, he'll help familiarize me, we'll sail to Annapolis, I'll get going. They got 8 miles down Wycomico River from Salisbury, and she started to sink. Anybody that has familiar at all with wooden boats, if you keep them out of the water, they need to swell up, and she needed to swell up, but she also needed a caulking, and it took 6 hours to dewater the boat and get it over to this White Haven place where you could haul it. They had climbed to haul it. And so the captain he had hired just said, I think I'll skip this trip and let you go on your own. So Meckling took the great Levin Marvel for his first time. Instead of sailing it by himself, he used the yawl boat, which you may or may not be familiar with if you know like a skipjack. It's a little motor launch, like a 20-footer. He took that and pushed it all the way to Baltimore. And it had swelled up enough to float, and he needed to caulk her. So he took her to Baltimore, and he took her to Booth Brothers Shipyard and said, look, I'll be back in the fall, I've got people waiting, just call her, below the water line. And he did. And $150, he was getting ready to leave the shipyard when the Coast Guard caught wind of this and said, what? You're going to take that old relic down to Annapolis and carry passengers for hire? No way. And the captain of the port sent his inspectors immediately to the shipyard, and they looked over the ship and said, you're not going anywhere. And Macklin said, oh, I'm sorry, you have no jurisdiction over me. And he was correct. Because in 1955, the Coast Guard had no jurisdiction under sailing vessels. They were uninspected. You could carry passengers. You could do anything you wanted if you were under 700 gross tons. Now that's big. That's like big, like ocean liner big, you know, in those days. That the leather marble was probably 100, maybe 150 gross tons. And so he was right. He was allowed to sail it without a license, with no inspection, and Coast Guard was infuriated because they had been after the U.S. Congress to give them jurisdictions over these small passenger vessels for years. Now here you see the Pelican, 42-footer, another uninspected small passenger vessel. This is the Pelican out on Montauk in Long Island, back in the summer of '54. Now, you could buy a ticket at Grand Central Station on the Long Island Railroad on Sunday morning for the Fisherman's Special for $1.50 at 6 a.m. Get on the train and ride it all the way to the far end of Long Island and jump on one of these head boats, catch your fish, and then go back into the city that night. They took as many people as they could, obviously, and here the typical day, the headboat fleet is heading out from Montauk, absolutely unregulated. They hit a swell, and a lot of the people went to one side of the boat because, you know, you do if it's like getting wet, and it capsized, and 47 people lost their life. Coast Guard had no jurisdiction, and they were, but Capitol Hill, as you know, things haven't changed much, they were loath to give Coast Guard regulation over small passenger vessels for various reasons. So, Mecklin had a great season in 1954. He took 7 trips. He took people from Annapolis. They would go wherever the wind blew. They'd come down here often. They'd come to Galesville. Here's the 11 Marble in Galesville. They would use the yawl boat to push it around, even though they weren't supposed to. Because even on a good day, with a fair amount of wind, that giant, heavy thing took lots of wind to move. And it would only move about max, like 4 knots on a really good day. So they used the yawl boat and hid from the Coast Guard, basically. And would have had a good run of it, probably. They had great business in '54, and then '55, a full book of reservations for the '55 season. And it was a great time for people that now remember, again, they just opened the Village. So people from this area, we're going to the Eastern Shore somewhat, but still, it's a very good, and you know, it's a good vacation to just go out and go sailing. Many of you know that because you're here in the marina. And so they would leave Annapolis if the wind was right. Maybe they'd go across to St. Michael's, or they'd come down here. They went as far as Solomon sometimes. And some of the keys to the success of the business were he was a great raconteur and he was a good sailor. I mean, he really was a good sailor. He could lay that boat in under sail at the city dock in Annapolis. He was also smart, and he hired a very good cook. And as any of you know that go on boating excursions, the food's a big deal, you know? And the other thing he would do is he'd invite people to stay the night on the boat the night before, and then, enjoy Annapolis. So it really became a very good vacation for people. He had 2 young guys that were rising seniors at Severn School up in Annapolis, which was the de facto prep school for the Naval Academy, and he hired those kids as deckhands, and that was a good move. The one kid's father was an offshore racing sailor, so he had a lot of sailing experience, and the other kid was Bill Verge, who is the son of an admiral from World War II, very much a ship-shaped guy, and those 2 kids gave a real face to the adventure for people. They could handle the sailing, and they could get the people involved. That coupled with a really good cook, and then there was a steward on board as well. So it was great, and the whole thing was going great until the last trip. That summer in '55, that last trip, you had a particularly interesting but pretty typical mix of passengers. This guy here is Bert Roberts. He was a very famous up-and-coming psychiatrist at Yale University. And his wife, they were taking their first vacation after the birth of their children, and they had scheduled themselves to go out to Cape Cod with his colleagues, but there was a polio outbreak, and he was afraid for the children. So they saw the ad in the New York Times and said, let's do this. There was also a very famous social psychiatrist on board named Louis Sobel, who had saved hundreds, if not thousands, of young orphans during World War II by heading up an evacuation committee. So there were luminaries, there were probably 4 doctors that trip, there were a lot of single women would go on this. And you think, well, what else would you do if you were a single gal and you had a little taste for adventure and you could really go someplace by yourself? So getting on this ship, there was a sense of camaraderie. People were generally very friendly and outgoing. I mean, you've got to have a little sense of adventure to take a trip like this to begin with. And so there were any number of singles on board. And in that passenger group was this guy, John Ferguson, who's our last living survivor. He was 16, and he kept a diary, believe it or not, throughout the whole trip, and had a great trip with his dad. He lost his dad in the tragedy, but he is a wealth of information, along with Bill Verge, as I mentioned earlier, the deckhand, who's also still living. So I had firsthand eyewitness accounts from those guys. This is a postcard that John sent home to his mom when he saw the ship in Annapolis. And it says, well, it's not the Queen Mary. He was disappointed. It looked like it was in bad shape. And he was, but he was a romantic, and he wanted to go anyway. And his dad said, well, forget it, we'll go, it's no problem. Now, Bert Roberts and his wife, she was actually anxious about it because she thought it looked really sketchy. And her husband said, well, if that famous guy Louis Sobel's on there, it's nothing could happen. He wouldn't get on something that wouldn't sail. Now, side note is, I gave a talk like this at the Maritime Museum at St. Michael's, and a guy said that he was a child and his father worked at Fawcett's on City Dock in Annapolis, a marine supply store. And he said his father always said every week when this boat would go out on Monday morning, the guys from Fawcett's would just shake their heads and go, look at those suckers. But that trip, they left on August 8th on Monday morning, and they went over and they spent their first night behind Poplar Island. And at that time, Poplar Island was probably about the size it is now. And so they would go there and a lot of times catch crabs and have like an al fresco on deck for the first night, an al fresco crab feast. And although this time they did not, because the weather was poor, it was pretty icky all week, and there was the threat of a hurricane. But the Hurricane Connie was way off of the Cuba, really, when they set off. And the thought was, you know, they're always within sight of land, and he could hurry to a hurricane hole if the weather changed. So, really, they didn't know, there was very little concern during the trip about the hurricane, although they were aware of it and listening to the weather. The second day they went to Oxford and they tied up there and spent the night. Everybody went ashore in Oxford. They went to the Robert Morris Inn, if you've ever been. They went to the bar, they watched Dragnet, and they had drinks and had a great time, and then woke up in the morning and took the ferry over to Bellevue. And that was a really fun thing. And then at this point now, the hurricane is Wednesday, and the hurricane's getting closer up. There was hurricane warnings are flying now from Manasquan all the way south to Cape Hatteras. So it was unclear what the weather was going to do. So Meckling decided to move to Cambridge, where he tied up. And if you've been to Oxford, back then the municipal dock is similar to what it is now. It's pretty light and small. But at Cambridge, he tied up into more industrial here. So he could cable the ship if it was going to blow. And so he moved over there, but he told the people, you know, the New Yorkers, he told them that, you know, we're going to Cambridge, it's a much bigger town. He's there, we're cosmopolitan, you'll have lots to do there. Cambridge. In 1955, hard to believe. But they woke up in the morning, and the hurricane warning had been lowered on Thursday morning, which was great. And this is John Ferguson's journal entry from Thursday, the last day of the trip before everything went crazy. And he said, this was the best day ever. He convinced his dad to let him stay on board for another week. He was having so much fun. Everybody was having a grand time. Meckling, they get up in the morning. It's the first super nice day of the trip. Classic, you know, late summer, beautiful day, not super hot, and the hurricane flags are down. So Meckling, instead of probably taking the judicious path and hurrying back to Annapolis, he took them swimming, and then in the chalk tank, and then had a nice picnic lunch, and then started down looking for Annapolis to get back on Friday evening. Because they knew a storm was coming, but it appeared that it had gone offshore. So they were drifting. He was expecting a northeast blow. So he was hoping to get pushed down the Choptank. He did not get the wind that night. They drifted down the Choptank River very slowly from Cambridge. And people enjoyed the heck out of the night. It was a starlit night. They watched the buoys going by. They got down by Oxford, and some of the young singles rallied together and said, we're almost out of booze. So they took the yawl boat into Oxford and picked up some supplies and came back to it was everybody was having a blast. Meckling turned off the radio at 11 because some of the older folks had gone to bed, and he missed the weather update, which would have told him that Connie had actually come ashore in North Carolina and was now tracking up the bay directly for him. And so, middle of the night, it starts to blow as they approach Eastern Bay. Things start getting a little crazy. By breakfast, around 7 in the morning, John Ferguson remembers water sloshing below the sole because the bilge pumps were not being able to keep up. Now remember, he was only caught below the water line, and he did not go back and finish the job. So the ship's leaking, the bilges are not really able to keep up. Water is coming in, the wind has built. So Mecklin comes to breakfast and sticks his head in and says, volunteers, please to help lower sails. So they get into the main stem of the Chesapeake and basically all hell breaks loose. They have no sail up except the mizzen, which they call a spanker on a three-masted schooner, and a stay sail to give it some steerage. The yawl boat has flooded, the engine is no longer functioning, the wind is now whipping up as you get those outer bands, they're very gusty bands. You've got some very old canvas on this thing. He cannot make a turn as he enters the bay to get north, to get back to Annapolis. It's clear he's not going to be able to go into that wind. So he attempts to go back to Poplar and get behind Poplar, getting the lead there. He can't make that turn. So he realizes he's just got to bust across the bay, which he does. He busts across the bay, thinking he could get to South River, because if you kind of imagine it, it's almost straight across from Poplar Island, and that's where he'd gotten to before he couldn't turn. No, he couldn't get in there. He got to Herring Bay. That was his only shot. So, as you all probably know, Herring Bay is shallow, and it, on a good day, is a little tricky. Now imagine in a tropical storm, which is what we were experiencing, though that was the level of winds, at that point, trying with no auxiliary power and just a little bit of sail on a very heavy ship that draws 12 feet, figuring out what you're going to do. This is not much of a harbor. So he anchors. As soon as he gets off of Fairhaven, he drops anchor. There's no relief because the waves are so steep. They're like 6 and 7 feet, as you can well imagine, in this shallow bay. So they're crashing across the deck. The people are huddled in the deck house. The cook generously, without regard for his own safety, has made sandwiches, trying to keep them moved light. Water is rising. All of the men are trying to help pump with everything from hand pumps to small gasoline pumps. It's very stressful, but still everybody remain calm. You're within sight of land, but not really because of the mist. And it becomes clear that they're going to have to abandon the ship. So they're all in life jackets. There's no life raft. And they begin a so-called orderly evacuation, which was interrupted when the ship just keeled over on one side, did not recover, and started to break up. So everyone was basically flung overboard and left to their own devices. So they're off of the mouth of Rockall Creek, about 1.5 miles. The wind is blowing them towards Rosehaven, if you're familiar. This jetty is the jetty at North Beach. It was 4 hours of being in the water before the first survivor made it to shore. And it was terrifying for everybody involved. John Ferguson never saw his dad after they went overboard. He got a piece of the deck house. The ship kind of broke up, so there was all this flotsam. So people were grabbing stuff and floating with it. And the first person to get ashore was one of the singles. Deborah Killick was a 26-year-old from Rochester, New York. She was very into open water swimming on the Lake Erie, so she was super familiar with open water swimming. She took 4 hours to get to shore. And the guys that were living right there on North Beach, there was a little community of cottages, and you can still see it if you're taking the ride from here to North Beach, and you know, right at the Anne Arundel line to Calvert County, there's like a little bridge there. Things have changed a little bit in that area, but there were cottages there along the bayfront. And these guys, these 2 brothers-in-law, you know, just like you would during a hurricane, they would, you know, at this holiday cottage, and they walked out to look like, wow, this is so intense. And they see the apparition of this woman literally staggering up the beach. So they rush down, grab her, get her in the house. She says, I'm from the Leaven Marble, there's 26 of us out there, we're all fighting for our lives. And the entire town of North Beach immediately mobilized for one of the most dramatic, you know, just on-the-fly rescue efforts. First, they, of course, called in everybody, Coast Guard and everybody, but it takes time for all these other people to respond. The people in North Beach, the volunteer firemen, for example, they were down on the shore, they got their emergency equipment, because remember, the ship went down at about 1:32 in the afternoon. It's starting to get dark. Plus, it's sheets of rain. I mean, this is now full-on, full-blast hurricane. So they put their lights out to help guide people to shore. People got on that jetty. These guys, 2 guys, George Kellum and Billy McWilliams, were young volunteer firemen from the area. They got in that skiff because 6 people, including the captain, had made it to a duck blind about 100 yards off, right off of North Beach. And they could see somebody waving their sou'wester, and nobody could get to them because it was too shallow. So they got this skiff. These guys made 3-4 trips in these 6-7 foot waves in this tiny skiff with a little outboard motor. And they rescued every single one of those people just before that duck blind collapsed. They were awarded the Carnegie Medal for Heroism and all sorts of other awards because really heroic act on their parts. Everybody in town was doing their part. Women were making soups and coffee and rushing them down. The volunteer fire department turned into a war. It was crazy. And the response, the local response, should make anybody who lives in this area or has any association with it proud of what a small community comes together on the fly can do. Because many lives were saved that day. Here you see the young deckhand and one of the passengers being brought in from that duck blind rescue. It was insane. The following morning, after Hurricane Connie just busted up the East Coast, every newspaper in the country was covering this story. How on earth was this decrepit old sailing ship out there in a hurricane? It was so much like listening to that testimony of that bounty that I told you about, where people were like, you know, why on earth were you out there in a hurricane? And that's what the coverage in the newspapers was. You had people, you know, from North Carolina on there, Chapel Hill. There was a couple, and he was a very well-known surgeon down there. So all of the North Carolina papers were covering it. It was an AP wire story, so it was everywhere. And of course, it got the attention of Washington, D.C. Finally, and their response was, what? How? Coast Guard, how could you let this happen? And they're like, oh, right, that's what we've been trying to tell you. So immediately Coast Guard convenes a hearing. It was about 1 week after the sinking that John Ferguson and all the survivors were called back to Baltimore to testify. We heard the captain's story. And it ended up that the Coast Guard immediately referred Mackley to the Department of Justice. And there was a quickly, hastily convened grand jury, and he was indicted on 14 counts of what amounted to maritime manslaughter. This was under maritime law, so it was slightly different charges, but it was manslaughter and it was negligence that he was charged with, taking an unseaworthy vessel to sea and endangering the lives and property of innocent sailors. It was a very highly publicized trial in Baltimore. It went on for 3 weeks in the early part of 1956. It was incredibly well covered, as you can imagine. And Mackley was represented pro bono by a very savvy Baltimore attorney who had been a judge and was a real maverick for justice for all. And his first thing was, let's not have a jury trial because there's no way you've been convicted in the court of public opinion. So he argued the case in front of Judge Dorsey Watkins, who ultimately made the decision, and Dorsey Watkins would later go on to become the head of the Supreme Court of Maryland. And he was also the person that brokered the deal to get Spiro Agnew to resign during the Watergate scandal, which was another crisis that we faced in this country. When Richard Nixon, if he hadn't resigned, Spiro Agnew would have been in line to go for president, but of course Spiro Agnew himself was under indictment in Baltimore County because he was a super crooked county executive and had been on the make during his entire time as vice president. So Dorsey Watkins got him to resign later on. So what you had is two real legal scholars and legal hard hitters going up against one another, going up against the DOJ, who had their best guy prosecuting. So it was a fascinating trial. It lasted 3 weeks. There was any number of witnesses, and I'm not going to tell you how it ended. That's that. But the day that Macklin took the stand in his own defense, President Eisenhower signed into law the first Small Passenger Safety Act of 1956 now. It was the first time that finally Congress acted and created regulation for Coast Guard to inspect the vessels themselves, make requirements of the people operating them, make, have crewing regulations. So if you had passengers for hire, the crew had to be in some way certified, and limitations on the number of passengers. Finally, and so it was ironic that the very day he was testifying, it got to the president's desk and it was signed. And it changed everything. You can get on a ship now, on a boat or a little ferry, and feel confident that it's been inspected because of the 11J Markle, really. And it kind of is ironic because I told you about the Edwin and Maude, which in 1953 went up to Maine and joined the Windjammer fleet. It appears on they changed the name to the Victory Chimes when it went to Maine, and it appears on the Maine quarter, one of those state quarters. So here's a Chesapeake Bay boat on a Maine quarter, and it's a beloved boat. I mean, if you ever went to Rockland, Maine, and it was like the queen of the fleet up there. Well, this year, Coast Guard condemned her. She was just too old. She was built in 1900, and there was just too much rot, and it was just too costly for the young owner to be able to fix it, and so he sold it. And it is now, if you want to see a Chesapeake Bay schooner, you go up to New York, it's gonna be a bar this summer. Chesapeake. Yeah, I imagine they'll call it Victory Chimes, anyway. But that's the sad story of the London Marble with a very significant ending. And if you have a question, I'll be happily to take it, but please call out, because I won't be able to see.
Right.
When the decision was made to abandon ship because it was going to sink,
Yeah,
and there was no lifeboat,
right.
was he just telling people to get into the water in a hurricane?
Well, that's a big question, and he had a kind of bad answer to it. His idea was to run a line through everybody's life jackets
Oh
and try to keep everybody together.
Oh my God.
And according to John Ferguson, that was like the worst possible thing.
Yeah.
And when he went over, he was in the midst of that little operation that the ship broke up, and he went over, and that line caught him on the ship, and he, to this day, says that he thinks it was his dad's last act, was to free him.
Wow.
Because he saw his dad, and then he kept going, Dad, Dad, and he was gone. And he thinks that his dad probably got hit overboard too, but he had that last instinct to save his son. Yeah, so that was like a terrible idea.
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah. And if you have anything else?
Question over here.
Yeah. Did the picture of the couple that you showed, the professor from Yale, did they survive?
No, he did not survive, and his wife survived, and his toddler daughters, of course, weren't on the ship. They survived, and one of the daughters has just turned 70, and she's come here for our recognition. We had a symposium at the Calvert Maritime Museum last summer, and she had the stories that her mother told her. And her mother told her that her father, because he was a doctor, had that mentality of get everybody else squared away and then I'll go. And she thinks he lingered too long because he was found really more around the wreckage. He never really got away from the ship. The mom, on the other hand, had the motherly instinct. She said, somebody's got to get back into those girls. And she pushed her, they went over and they were in that lounge still, and she pushed her way through a window and made her way. And yeah, it's quite dramatic, like to think about the lives lost that day and how they were lost,
Question.
Yeah, please.
Go ahead.
Is the wreck noted on
Yeah.
any of the nautical charts?
Yes, it's noted as a wreck. Now, it was initially, so what happened, as you can imagine, was it broke up, and within 2 days, Eastern Shore Watermen got the entire rig, which was floating. So a lot of places on the Eastern Shore, apparently, now I haven't seen this, but, people have a piece of the mast of the, but there's a lot of stuff washed up onto the shore at Fairhaven. Lots of people have stuff from the ship in Fairhaven, but there was enough wreckage that it was a hazard to navigation, and it had a buoy marking it starting in 55. That was removed by 87. It was just the NOAA charts just indicated it as a wreck. And now it's just a small X. I don't know if you ever see that if you look on your chart, it's almost like due off of the mouth of Rockwell Creek. You'll see it. There's a couple other wrecks there. It's well noted. And the Maryland State marine archaeologist is absolutely clear where it is. And she dove on it and knows it was that because she was able to see the sinks from those cabins in a line. They were all plumbed together, and she saw that. She could see that on her side scan sonar, and then she investigated. But it's buried, completely buried, so you don't have a hazard. It sank in 22 feet of water. I think it's up to 17 feet now. So it's covered in stuff. Yeah. Did somebody have a question? No.
I'm curious whether the wreck site has been listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Is it protected?
I don't think so. That's a question for Susan Langley.
Yeah.
I know it's very much an archaeological site.
Perfect.
One more question.
I did have one other question.
Go.
I'm struck that everyone who went in the water, they were in the water for 4 hours, and so many still survived. What time of year was this?
So it's
And what
August
were the
12th.
temps? Yeah.
It was August 12th, and it was warm, and the water was warm, but the wind and the waves were so bad that the one deckhand, the young guy that was the offshore sailor's son, he told me he was 114 pounds soaking wet that summer. He almost died of hypothermia from being in and out of the water, floating.
So hypothermia was an issue by that point.
Oh yes, back then it was. In fact, all of the survivors were transported to Calvert Hospital and Annapolis with hypothermia. I think it's called exposure back in
I got
there.
a question.
Yeah.
Obviously, they've all had life jackets.
Yes, they
Is
do.
that true?
Yes.
Okay. At least he had those.
At least he had life jackets, yeah. Although he got in trouble, like the Coast Guard gave him a whole laundry list of the first inquiry. And one of the things was, like, typical meckling. He bought the life jacket secondhand off of a Virginia ferry called the Gloucester. So they were all stenciled with Gloucester, not leaded-veil, which in this case didn't matter, but would have mattered had they been in open waters. Anyway, I've got some of the books. If you're interested, I'll happily inscribe them to you, and I hope you guys will take this as a cautionary tale.
Yes, ma'am.
On that note, guys, I want to point out something. Save this number in your phone, 410-576-2525. If you're on the water and you have an emergency, call that number before you call 911, because all 911 is going to do is call that number. That's the Coast Guard Annapolis emergency phone number right there. So when the Coast Guard auxiliary was in here a couple weeks ago, and they pointed that out, that nobody calls that number directly. They're out in the bay, they have an emergency, they call 911. 911 calls them, they're just wasting time. So call that number first. So, all right, we're going to take a break for just a minute and get the other presenters set up, so you guys kind of meet around.